He was 6 years old. By itself, that detail might not have meant much. But as the story unfolded, almost without anyone noticing, it moved to the very center of everything. He was 6 years old, and he lived hundreds of miles away from Boston. A quiet town, a place you wouldn't notice unless you looked for it on a map. Away from major roads, untouched by hurry. He had never been there. He hadn't driven past it with his family, hadn't stopped there on a vacation, hadn't seen it on television and grown curious. Neither had his parents. And yet, this child began to talk about a place he had never visited, and what he described was not vague. He didn't say, a house by the sea. He didn't say, a big place. He described the direction of the streets, the distance between the houses, the angle at which the sun hit the windows. He spoke of a 3-story house, white on the outside, standing right at the edge of the water. There was a small dock in front of it. Boats would pull in there, he said. And when he spoke, he didn't pause. He didn't think. He didn't guess. The sentences didn't search for words. The details didn't hesitate. It was as if he were recalling a memory. As if he had stood there before and looked out at the sea. That is why this story, which at first sounded like an innocent child's account, very quickly turned into something else. Because there are details that unsettle you for no clear reason. And there are questions that once asked cannot be taken back. In this story, that question was simple. How can a child describe a place he has never been to with this much detail? The child's name was Ethan Miller. He lived with his family in a small town near the Appalachian Mountains. Compared to big cities, the place was almost invisible. There were no flashy buildings, no historic landmarks. But everyone knew each other. The same coffee shop opened every morning. The lights went out early in the evenings. Ethan's life moved within this rhythm. He went to kindergarten. He had toy cars. Sometimes he did homework at the kitchen table. Sometimes he lined his toys up on the floor. To his family, everything was normal. Until Ethan began to talk. He was 2 years old. His sentences were incomplete. His words were missing pieces. But what he said was consistent. At first, they were small phrases, then short sentences. Over time, he began repeating the same things. His parents didn't think much of it. Children imagine things. They mix up what they hear. But what Ethan described didn't change. The same house, the same place, the same details. And the strangest part was this. As these descriptions continued, they didn't evolve. They didn't become more complex. They didn't grow more elaborate. They stayed exactly the same. And that was the moment when the direction of the story began to shift. Slowly, almost without anyone noticing. What Ethan described gradually began to take on a clearer shape. At first, there were only fragmented expressions, sentences that began with before, sometimes words that never fully formed. But then, a whole emerged. Ethan said that, before, he had been a wealthy man. He didn't say it with pride, certainly not with boastfulness. It sounded as if he were passing along information. We had a house, he said. It was big. At first, his parents assumed it was part of a game. Children sometimes declare themselves kings, sometimes superheroes. But what Ethan described didn't feel like play. The place was specific. Newport, Rhode Island. When they heard the name for the first time, they hesitated. There were no books about Newport in their town's library. It wasn't a place that came up often on the television channels they watched at home. Where could Ethan have heard that name? But what was even stranger was the way he described Newport. Not like a vacation spot. Not like a postcard. Like someone who had lived there. It used to be crowded in the summers, he said. Then it would grow quiet. As he said this, his expression didn't change. There was no excitement, no nostalgia, just information. Then he began to talk about his family. He gave a surname, Whitmore. His parents wrote the name down. Not for any particular reason, just to remember it. Ethan pronounced the name the same way every time. The pronunciation didn't shift. The emphasis didn't change, as if the name was already settled in him. One day, his mother asked, "What is our last name?" Ethan answered without hesitation. But immediately after, he added, "It used to be different." The sentence created a brief silence in the kitchen. It didn't last long, but it was felt, because it wasn't the kind of sentence a child easily invents. Over time, Ethan's accounts began to align into a timeline. What he referred to as before clearly belonged to a time long before his birth. He didn't say this directly, he didn't give dates, but the way he spoke separated two lives, and that separation felt deliberate. The description of the house sat at the center of the story. Each time Ethan returned to it, the details stayed fixed. It was 3 stories tall. It was white. It stood right at the edge of the sea. When he said this, he didn't use his hands. He didn't draw. He didn't point or gesture. He simply said it. There was a small dock in front. Boats would pull in there. Sometimes big, he said. Sometimes small. When he added that detail, his father's eyebrows lifted slightly, because this was not the kind of thing a child usually pays attention to. There was something else behind the house, a chapel, hidden among trees, hard to see from the road. When Ethan spoke about the chapel, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't assign it importance. He spoke of it as if it were a natural part of the house. One day, his mother asked, "What was the chapel used for?" Ethan shrugged. "I don't know," he said. "It was just there." The answer was unexpectedly consistent, because remembered things don't always carry meaning. Sometimes they simply exist. He rarely described the inside of the house. He didn't give the number of rooms. He didn't describe the furniture, but he talked about the windows. "They looked out to the sea," he said. "The morning light would come in." As he said this, his eyes fixed on a single point, as if, in that moment, he was looking at a different morning. Without realizing it, his parents began to change the way they asked questions. They tried not to guide him. They were careful not to add details. But Ethan wasn't being guided. No matter what was asked, he gave the same answers, with the same words, in the same order. And this house slowly stopped feeling like an image. It began to feel like an address. When Ethan spoke of the house, he always returned to the same point. But this time, he wasn't talking about the house itself. He began speaking about the structure next to it. He said there was another mansion attached to the property, bigger, older. When he talked about it, his tone didn't change. There was no reverence, no admiration, just information. He said the owner of this mansion was a well-known person, a famous woman. He gave her name, Margaret Holloway. The name lingered in the kitchen for a moment. His parents looked at each other. Neither of them had ever heard it before. They didn't ask Ethan how he knew the name, because asking that question might have meant guiding him. But Ethan wasn't offering explanations. "She was there," he said, "right next to us." He described where the mansion stood, which side of the house it was on, how the gardens connected. He didn't mix things up. He didn't contradict himself. Once his father asked, "Would you go there?" Ethan shook his head. "No," he said. That was her place. The sentence carried more weight than expected, because children usually share spaces. They turn places into playgrounds. But Ethan drew clear boundaries. Over time, the name became a reference point for the family. When they spoke among themselves, instead of saying, "that woman," they began to say, "Holloway." Still, they had no idea whether the name had any counterpart in the real world. Ethan rarely brought it up, but when he did, he said the same things. The mansion was large, the garden was well kept. People would come. When? Why? Who? He didn't say. As if the place, in his story, served only as a marker. One day, his mother noticed something. When Ethan talked about the mansion, he added no emotion, no admiration, no anger, no fear. And that pushed it a little farther away from imagination. Because imagination is usually emotional. Memories, on the other hand, are more neutral. And the name Margaret Holloway was becoming a turning point in this story. The life Ethan described was not made up of places alone. Over time, people began to take shape. First, he spoke of a wife. He didn't give her name clearly, but he described where she was from. "Europe," he said. She spoke differently than we did. When he said this, he didn't imitate her. He didn't play with accents. He was simply pointing out a difference. Then came the children. He said there were 3 of them, that their names sounded foreign, not American. At this point, his parents were especially careful. They kept their questions short. They didn't ask for details. But Ethan wasn't offering details anyway. When he spoke about family, the subject he lingered on most was something else. Work. He said what the family did for a living, but he didn't elaborate. "Leather," he said. "Leather things." He always used the phrase in exactly the same way. He didn't add technical terms. He didn't list products. But the symbol of the work was always the same. A large, dark brown leather briefcase. This briefcase appeared in every scene Ethan described. Inside the house, when leaving, when going down to the boats. One day, his mother asked, "Why do you remember the briefcase?" Ethan shrugged. "It was with me," he said. The answer was simple, but revealing. Because people remember the things they carry with them, especially if they carry them every day. The briefcase didn't feel symbolic. It didn't carry a sense of duty. It was just an everyday object. When Ethan spoke about work, he emphasized one thing in particular. This work required the house. In the summers, he said, people would come. At the time, the sentence felt like just another detail. Later it would mean more. For his parents, though, another piece had quietly fallen into place. This story was more orderly than a child's invented tale, and that, perhaps, was the most unsettling part. Within the life Ethan described, time moved differently. He didn't divide the year into 4 seasons. He divided it into 2. Summer, he would say, and everything else. This division appeared in every conversation. When summer arrived, the house came alive. Boats docked more often. There were sounds in the garden. But when he described this, he didn't brighten. There was no sense of vacation, no trace of longing. It was as if he were describing a cycle. In the summer months, the house was in use. People came, some stayed briefly. Who they were, he didn't say, or chose not to. But when summer ended, the house grew quiet. The doors would close, he said. The furniture stayed. He used the sentence the same way every time. The doors would close. The furniture stayed. At that point, his parents began listening more closely, because this was not a kind of storytelling commonly found in a child's imagination. When Ethan talked about summers, he didn't place himself at the center. He didn't say, "I did." He didn't say, "We went." He mostly reported what happened. Sometimes his mother asked, "What about winter?" Ethan shrugged. "We were somewhere else," he said. "That place was closed." They didn't ask where, because that question would have forced the story. But one thing was clear in Ethan's account. This house did not belong to the entire year. It was a small detail, but a critical one. One that would only make sense after further investigation. When Ethan spoke of summers, he didn't describe the weather. He didn't talk about the color of the sea. He talked about sounds. The engines heard in the mornings, the slowing movement in the evenings. These were not the kinds of details a child typically invents, because children usually describe images. Sounds, however, are traces of lived experience. And so, summer stopped being a season in this story. It became a marker. At a certain point, everything changed for Ethan's parents. At first they listened, they smiled, they brushed it off. But now, that was no longer possible, because the story was expanding, and as it expanded, it didn't produce contradictions. On the contrary, it began to fit together. Ethan's parents were people of faith, but they were not easily convinced. And precisely for that reason, they were forced to ask themselves one question: how could a child know these things? The family had no connection to Europe. They had never heard the name Whitmore before. They had no ties to Newport. There were no books about Newport in their home, no maps, no old magazines. Their television habits were limited. Documentaries were rarely on. The father had left the Boston area only once in his life, and that was for a brief work trip. The mother and Ethan, never. While the family wrestled with these questions, Ethan kept talking, with the same words, in the same order. He didn't add anything. He didn't remove anything. One evening, the mother noticed something. Even when they stopped asking questions altogether, the story continued on its own, which meant the narration was not dependent on prompts. That realization gave rise to another doubt. If this were fiction, why wasn't it developing? Why wasn't it becoming more elaborate, more dramatic? Because children usually expand their stories. Ethan stayed in the same place. This began to unsettle the family. But it wasn't fear. It was something closer to uncertainty. And uncertainty, more often than not, is heavier than fear. It was at this point that the family realized they needed an outside perspective. But they didn't know where to turn. A teacher, a doctor, a religious figure. The answer had not yet appeared, but time would make the decision for them. The year was 2012, the time 7:40 p.m. This moment would later be written down again and again, because everything began that evening. An Australian-born psychologist was in the United States for research purposes. His name was Dr. Andrew Keller. The institution he was affiliated with, University of Melbourne. Professionally, Dr. Keller was accustomed to encountering unusual claims, especially those involving children. Children sometimes mix up what they hear. Sometimes they imagine. Sometimes they invent stories to gauge adult reactions. For this reason, he approached accounts labeled past life memories with caution. To him, these were not truths to be proven. They were claims to be tested. When Ethan's story reached him, he felt no special anticipation. Just another case, another account to be documented. Still, he wanted to listen. That evening, he went to the Miller family's home. The house was simple and orderly. Nothing about it was showy. When Dr. Keller took his seat in the living room, Ethan sat across from him. The child was calm. He didn't fidget. He didn't scan the room. When questions came, the answers did not hesitate. Within the first few minutes, Dr. Keller noticed something. Ethan wasn't constructing a story as he spoke. He didn't pause to think. There was no sense of, how should I say this? Each question seemed to open a ready-made drawer. Ethan spoke of Newport, of the house, of the sea. His words were simple, but their sequence was unbroken. Dr. Keller began to take notes. 3-story house, white exterior, right on the water, dock, chapel behind the house, mansion next door, Margaret Holloway, the Whitmore family, leather trade, dark brown briefcase, summer months, house closed in winter, death in 1958 or 1959. As the list grew longer, Dr. Keller's brow tightened slightly. Because this was not a random narrative. This was a repeating, coherent structure. When the meeting ended, Dr. Keller thanked them. As he left the house, he had no clear conclusion in mind. But something stayed with him. Ethan had not changed a single detail. Children usually adjust their stories based on the reactions of the adults in front of them. They add more when they see a smile. They pull back when they sense doubt. Ethan had done neither. He hadn't tried to be more interesting. He hadn't retreated. When Dr. Keller got into his car, he reread his notes. One point in particular was underlined: the summer months. This was not the kind of detail a child would easily invent, because summer homes imply a specific socioeconomic structure, and that structure did not match the environment Ethan was growing up in. That night, Dr. Keller couldn't sleep for a long time, not because the story was extraordinary, but because it was too orderly. The next morning, the first thing he did was begin researching Newport, Rhode Island. Maps, satellite images, old property records. There were hundreds of houses, thousands of possible matches. But Ethan had left one reference point: Margaret Holloway. That name was the first concrete lead in the story. Dr. Keller considered the possibility that it was pure chance. If the name appeared in no records, the case would largely collapse. But if it did, even thinking this, he stopped himself. Science does not move forward with assumptions. It moves forward with data, and the data was pointing him toward Newport. Dr. Keller planned his first trip. It would either be a journey of verification or the moment everything unraveled. He didn't know yet. But one thing was certain: this file would stay on the table. Arriving in Newport was harder than expected. The city looked small, but its history was dense. The streets were not narrow. The houses were grand. Every corner belonged to a different era. Dr. Keller pulled his car over and looked around for a moment. This could have been the place Ethan described, but it could just as easily have been anywhere. There were hundreds of old houses, dozens of docks, countless mansions. So Dr. Keller didn't wander randomly. His first stop was the records, municipal archives, old property maps, deeds, and there, unexpectedly, a name appeared: Margaret Holloway. Her name showed up in multiple documents during a specific period, in a specific area. Dr. Keller took notes, marked addresses. Then he looked at the map, and he noticed something. Right next to the mansion, listed under Holloway's name, stood another structure, 3 stories tall, white facade, directly on the water. Dr. Keller approached on foot. Standing in front of the house, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The doors were closed, the windows were dark, but the building didn't look abandoned. It simply wasn't being used. In front of the house was a small dock, weathered, but still there. When he walked behind the house, a small structure appeared between the trees. A chapel. Dr. Keller stopped. Later, when he tried to describe that moment, he chose his words carefully. To see a structure described by a child standing in front of me, unchanged. He didn't finish the sentence, because scientists are careful about where they stop. He walked around the house, examined the garden boundaries, checked the positions of neighboring buildings. Everything matched Ethan's account. But a house alone was not proof. Dr. Keller knew that, and because of that, the hardest part was only just beginning. The next day, Dr. Keller began asking questions. First, the neighbors. Most of them shook their heads. "I don't know," they said. "It's been empty for a long time." Some mentioned that the house was used during the summers, but by whom? They didn't know. That detail aligned with what Ethan had described. Still, on its own, it wasn't enough. Dr. Keller went to the municipality, down into the archives. Many records were missing. Some had been lost in a fire. Others had never been digitized. Hours passed, days passed, and for the first time, Dr. Keller considered the possibility that he might be wrong, that Ethan's account was nothing more than a series of coincidental overlaps. Just as that thought began to settle in, he met an elderly man. someone who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. His voice was slow, his memory stronger than expected. Dr. Keller asked his questions carefully. He didn't offer names. He didn't guide the answers. And then the man spoke. "Yes," he said, "I remember the Whitmores." The air in the room changed. The man said the family was of European origin, that they arrived in the summer and disappeared in the winter. He mentioned a leather business, and he added that the man always carried a large bag. Dr. Keller wrote everything down. His expression didn't change, because a single witness was not enough, scientifically. So before leaving Newport, he made a decision. This wasn't sufficient. More was needed, and that realization would bring him back again. When Dr. Keller left Newport, he carried no final conclusion. But he was now certain of one thing. This case was not a simple misunderstanding. In 2013, he returned to Newport for a second time. This time, he wasn't alone. He met with local historians, people familiar with the archives, those who knew the city's past. Once again, he chose his questions carefully. He didn't supply names. He let others fill in the details. And what he heard was no longer something that could be dismissed as coincidence. The Whitmore family was indeed known in the area. They were of European origin. They were wealthy. The seaside house, used only during the summers, appeared in official records. Documents showed that the house had been actively used until the late 1950s. The family's involvement in leather-related trade was confirmed. And yes, the head of the family was known for always carrying a large leather briefcase. The exact date of death was unclear, but the range fell between 1958 and 1959. Dr. Keller compared Ethan's statements with his notes. The details aligned. But then he stopped. Because science does not reach conclusions based on matches alone. He examined alternative explanations one by one. Information leakage? The family had no motivation to feed such information to a child, and the accounts had begun at the age of 2. Coincidence? That many specific details aligning by chance was statistically difficult. A psychological condition? Ethan's development was evaluated. There were no signs of confusion between fantasy and reality. A neuroscientific explanation? Experts acknowledged that child memory can behave in unexpected ways. But no clear model existed to explain narratives this consistent and this verifiable. Dr. Keller published his findings, carefully worded, avoiding definitive claims. "This case," he wrote, "suggests that some of our existing explanatory frameworks may be insufficient." Reactions in academic circles were mixed. Some praised the methodology. Some urged caution. Others remained unconvinced. And that was expected. Because science does not produce comforting answers. It asks difficult questions. As Ethan grew older, his accounts became less frequent. Then, they stopped entirely. Today, he lives an ordinary life. He rarely speaks of this story. But what remains is a file and a question. Does consciousness end with the body, or do some traces carry over into another life? At a conference, Dr. Andrew Keller responded to that question like this: "I don't know what happened, but I do know this. We cannot fully explain this case using the explanations we currently have." Perhaps that is the point. Some stories do not end with a conclusion. They simply leave a gap. And that gap may be more powerful than any answer.